Welcome. My name is Jerry Schlosser. I'll be the moderator for today's forum. The League of Women Voters and the Dakota Media Access organization have crafted this event so that we can have a better, deeper understanding of Measure 5. Joining me today is Steve Adair, who will be representing the pro or in support of the measure. Steve is the chairman of North Dakotans for Clean Water, Wildlife, and Parks. And John Gottfried, sorry John, representing the composition or the opposition to the measure. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Measure number 5, we're on the same page, basically says this: the measure upon voter approval would redirect 5% of the state's oil extraction tax revenue to a Clean Water, Wildlife, and Parks Trust and Fund. Of the revenue received, 90% would be deposited into a fund, while 10% would deposit into a trust. The fund would be used to provide grants to the public and private agencies to aid their work in improving water quality, natural flood control, fish and wildlife habitat, parks and outdoor recreation areas, access for fishing and hunting, land acquisitions for parks, and outdoor education. The fund would be governed by a commission comprised of the governor, attorney general, agriculture commissioner, with a 13-member citizen accountability board to review and make recommendations on grant applications. So, with a little bit of an understanding, today's forum is going to work this way. We're going to have an opening remark from both of our guests. They'll have 60 seconds to do a remark. We have 13 questions that we'll be going through, but alternating back and forth between our guests, and they get a chance to respond. We did a drawing, and John was the successful winner. So we'll start with John. John, you have 60 seconds for your opening remarks.
Well, thanks, Jerry, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for setting this up. This is a very important issue, and obviously it's good to be able to talk about it. I represent the North Dakotans for Common Sense Conservation. We're a group of over 70 North Dakota organizations representing energy, industry, business, ag, and education who have come together to oppose Measure 5. We represent more than 360,000 farmers, 288,000 employees, 30,000 families, 10,000 businesses, 1,700 state and local officials, 300 cities, 55 conservation districts in all 53 counties. We oppose this measure for 3 basic reasons. 1, the dollar amount, the pure dollar amount that goes into this fund. 2, the constitutionality of it. And 3, the fact that it places conservation in this fund at a much higher priority than many of our other needs in our state right now, such as infrastructure, education, and tax relief.
Thank you, John. Steve?
Yeah, you bet. So my name is Steve Adair. I'm the chairman of North Dakotans for Clean Water, Wildlife, and Parks, and we're a grassroots organization made up of right now over 300 teachers and farmers and ranchers, small business owners, healthcare professionals, conservation organizations, and sportsmen's group around the state that have come together to really address the dramatic changes we are seeing across North Dakota. So we are losing grassland at rates not seen since the days of the Dust Bowl. Our communities continue to struggle with chronic flooding, and we're dealing with the impacts of one of the largest oil fields in the entire world, and that's created big challenges for our state. And we can take a small percentage of our prosperity today and invest it in this granting fund to make sure that we maintain many of the things that we all love and cherish about our great state.
Thank you, Steve. Let me just back up and say that, apologize, John, I didn't introduce you and say John is the Vice President of Government Affairs for Greater North Dakota Chamber, so I want to make sure and get that in there. Into our questions, start off with the first of our 13 questions. The first one is, what is the intent of the measure? or what do you believe to be the intent of the measure? And since John started, we'll start this one with Steve.
Yeah. So the real focus of the measure is to create a granting fund that would be managed by 3 of our state's highest elected officials, so our governor, our attorney general, and our ag commissioner. And this really provides opportunity for our local communities, our cities, our counties, our school districts, our parks districts, our conservation organizations, our state agencies to address the challenges that they face in their community with maintaining water quality, with increasing tools for flood control, and to make sure that our recreation areas continue to grow and are available to the people of our state. And so it's really, in a nutshell, to provide resources for voluntary and incentive-based conservation in North Dakota, something that we have a long history of and great success with.
Okay, thank you, Steve. John?
Well, I guess what we see the intent of, and I think we can agree that this is a conservation measure. We disagree on how this, whether this is the right way to address conservation in our state. We see there's a lot of issues within this measure, whether it be the constitutionality of it, the 75% spending mandate, the dollar amount that goes into this fund, that really kind of tweak the overall intent. I think it's being sold as the Clean Water, Wildlife, and Parks Fund. Everybody likes clean water and wildlife and parks. We do too in the North Dakotans for Common Sense Conservation. We're concerned that this money could be funneled into these certain nonprofit organizations to cover things such as staffing, research, and those type of things, as well as within the measure itself, it does allow for land purchase. So those are some real concerns that we've got. So we think the intent, the broad intent is obviously conservation, but the steps that you take to get there, we've got some real issues with.
Thanks, John. Our second question, and John's going to be the first one to respond. From your perspective, what are possible unintended consequences if this was to pass?
Well, I think there are a lot of unintended consequences. When you're talking about $300 million of biennium starting off with, that'd be going into this fund, at a time when our state's needs are so great. We've got needs in infrastructure, we've got needs in education, we've got needs all across the board. We're in a great situation in North Dakota. Our state is growing, our economy is booming. And I think we've seen some of the legislators even come out in the western area talking about a $2 billion infrastructure program. That's a significant investment that they feel is needed in western North Dakota. To take $300 million off the table to address some of these other needs, we think swings the pendulum too far. It pushes everything into the conservation side of things, which again we've got concerns with how that money gets spent, and it'll at the behest of our education community, our infrastructure community, and even tax relief within North Dakota. So we think it's simply too much and it goes too far.
Okay, thanks, John. Steve?
Yeah, so we believe when you really look at the numbers, so OMB has just come out and said that in the next biennium, North Dakota will receive almost $10 billion in oil and gas tax income. So if you look at what they've said this measure would allocate from that, so it's about $259 million for the next biennium. So that leaves $9.75 billion of oil and gas tax income that the state has to meet these other needs. So we've been really careful in crafting this message, realizing we care about our funding for schools. This measure actually provides more funding for schools. We care about the infrastructure needs in the state, and this amount of funding will not impact the resources that we have available for that. We've also been attentive to this concern about unintended consequences. So this measure strictly prohibits the funds being used for litigation, funds being used for lobbying. None of the funds can leave the state of North Dakota. None of them can be used for condemnation of land. They can't be used to adversely impact mineral extraction in the state. And we believe by having the governor, the attorney general, the ag commissioner make all the final decisions about how these funds will be used, that safeguards are in place to prevent any of the the boogeymen that people are worried about with this measure.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Question number 3. How will this reduce the impact of oil development? And we'll start with Steve.
Yeah, so there's great opportunities with this fund to address the challenges that are happening in the Bakken. Of course, that development has brought great resource to our state and providing jobs and revenue, but we do have issues with spills out there. There's a recent incident at Mandaree where a large saltwater spill would have come into the town's drinking water source, we were fortunate to have wetlands in the path of that water that were able to intercept and filter that water out to protect that town's drinking water source. But we got lucky in that case. We can take these wetlands and strategically place them near our drinking water sources to help filter runoff. We can also make better decisions about where we site things. A lot of the companies coming into the Bakken are from out of state. They don't understand the melt that happens in North Dakota in the spring, and a lot of areas are placed in the path of water flow. And if we can take and more strategically place a lot of that development out there, then we can keep it out of harm's way, still facilitate mineral extraction, but protect our drinking water in our special places in this state.
Thank you, Steve. Now we'll go for response from John.
Well, I think what we see with the impact of oil development, or what this fund may have on the impact of oil development, is it goes back to the infrastructure. We've got over 25,000 open jobs right now in North Dakota, and North Dakota, we're attracting a lot of workforce here because of some of our outdoors and the opportunities we have out there. But as well, the one thing that I think attracts people faster is homes and schools and having good communities set up. And like I said before, we've had our Western legislators come before us and say, we're looking at a $2 billion investment is what we need in order to address what we feel are the needs out west. And that's a massive investment. And just to touch a little bit more on the dollar amount, when Mr. Adair talks about the small investment that this could be, if this fund were in place this biennium, it would have been the 6th largest state agency in North Dakota. That would have been funded just ahead of North Dakota State University, the money that goes into that. So that's where we want to talk when we talk about shifting the pendulum and maybe elevating the priorities too much in one direction, and at the bequest of infrastructure, education, and tax relief. So I think when we're talking about the dollars, we need to really put that into context and look at where other things rank up in our state. We do have a $10 billion revenue coming in, but it takes a lot of money to run this state, and it takes a lot of money to address all the challenges we have with a growing state. And we think this is one of the wrong ways to do it.
Thank you, John. John, we'll start off with the answer. The next question 4, which says, how does this fund resemble or differ from other trust funds, such as the Outdoor Heritage Fund?
Well, that's a great question. We worked together with Steve and his group and many of the same groups that are part of the North Dakotans for Common Sense Conservation to develop the Outdoor Heritage Fund. That fund was put into place last biennium, was capped at $30 million going into it. I also serve on the board of the Outdoor Heritage Fund. So to give a little background on what we're doing in North Dakota with conservation is the Outdoor Heritage Fund has gone through 3 grant rounds. We've done 48 grants have been approved. Just over $14 million of taxpayer dollars have been given into the conservation efforts, which we were able to parlay that into about $75 million of impact. And we think that's the right way to go about it. It's a statutory fund. It can be moved up and down as our needs ebb and flow. And we think it's the right balance that you have on the advisory committee. You're equally represented from farming, from business, from conservation. All have a say in this issue, which I think is a great way to do public policy, because you've got, I may not be the conservation expert, but I know business. I'm imagining Steve is a conservation expert. He may not understand some of the nuances that we see within our individual industries. So we can all come to the table and say, well, Steve may think this is a great program. I may look at it a little differently. We can hash it out in the middle. And that's what the Outdoor Heritage Fund has provided us.
Okay. Thank you, John. Steve?
Yeah, great question. So I do want to go back a little bit when John called this a state agency. So this is not a new state agency. This is a granting fund, just like you mentioned. It is another special fund in the state, and it will be administered by an existing agency, the Industrial Commission, and they can use 3% of that funds for administration. So it's really a granting fund like our other special funds in the state. We have a Common Schools Trust Fund, we have the Outdoor Heritage Fund, we have the Resources Trust Fund. So that's really how it will operate. The Outdoor Heritage Fund was a great start. We were right there with John and helping to develop that. We advocated for that through the legislature. It is a good start. Our belief is that it is too little, too slow to really take care of the needs in the state. We are seeing changes like North Dakota has never seen before. These are unprecedented times. So if you take a go slow approach, you may get to the point to where you lose so much of your land and water that it's tough to get it back. And if you look around us at some of our neighbors and see what's happened in places like Iowa and southern Minnesota, they have reached that point. They have lost 90% of their grasslands and their wetlands. They have tremendous challenges with water quality in those states, even greater flooding issues than we do, and they've lost their recreational economy. And in the fall, if we're seeing right now, all of those people come to North Dakota to recreate because we still have these great resources, and we can maintain them if we're proactive today. But they will not continue to exist by chance. It will take action and leadership to get there.
Thank you. Number 5. If Measure 5 is not passed, what will be done to reduce the impact on oil development? We'll start with Steve.
Well, I think there are definitely some steps moving in that direction. There is a list of best management practice. We have actually been involved in an energy forum with the conservation groups and energy companies sitting down together and talking about, how can this development be managed to have the least impact. There's been some good ideas coming out of it. The challenge has been there hasn't been the people and resources to implement them. So while we have generated ideas, there's not a lot of action happening on the ground. This fund could really be, the resources to put people and programs on the ground to minimize those impacts. So I think without this fund, that development will get ahead of our ability in North Dakota to manage it, and we'll see impacts continue to grow and challenge us to keep up with.
Okay, thank you, Steve. John?
Well, I think we've seen some of what would happen if this fund is defeated, or if this measure is defeated. The governor's come out and talked about continuing the discussion on conservation and putting an additional $20 million into the Outdoor Heritage Fund, as well as directing roughly $50 million directly to some park infrastructure projects. Going back to the Outdoor Heritage Fund and what that is serving, Mr. Adair talks about the great need we have in our state. Serving on that board, I haven't seen those grant proposals that come forward asking for those large projects. We started the fund with $30 million. I think it's important to walk before you run. We can figure this thing out. We haven't seen those large, massive needs projects that have come forward. So if they're out there, they're not coming to the conservation fund, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, we've got a fund in our state that we've created for conservation efforts to direct to conservation, and those grant proposals simply aren't coming. So I serve on that board, and every grant round I've sat there and reviewed the proposals and looked at it, and I've thought, well, how would I spend $150 million? If I had to spend $150 million a year, how would I do it? And it goes back to staffing and land purchases. That'd be the easiest way to do it. And frankly, I don't think that's the right use for taxpayer dollars, and I think that's a choice North Dakotans are going to have to make.
Okay, thank you, John. John will answer the question first. The next question states, what public conservation initiatives are in place currently? Are these initiatives sufficient? Why or why not? John?
Well, I think at this point in our state, the Outdoor Heritage Fund is proving to be a good start, as Steve said, and we've looked at how do we increase the funding to that. The governor has indicated, that he's willing to look at putting another $20 million into that. I think that's a great step. Steve has talked about the conservation groups working with some of the energy companies to develop best practices. That's how we do things in North Dakota. We come together and collaborate and say, okay, what's the win? How do we get to a win-win situation here? And I think we did that with the Outdoor Heritage Fund. I think the conservation groups have tried to do that with the energy companies. I think they're working very well there. But I think this measure kind of flies in the face of all that. It comes across as very aggressive and very, frankly, too far. Like I've said before, you're looking to elevate your needs ahead of everybody else's, which goes back to the infrastructure, the education, and other North Dakotans' other needs across our state, which we think is the wrong move.
Okay, thank you. Steve?
Yeah, Jerry, so as a state, North Dakota has done very little for for conservation. If you look at our overall state budget, our investment in clean water, wildlife, and parks is about 1.3% of our overall state budget. And if you look how we rank with other states in the country, we're about 42nd in state spending on conservation, behind a lot of the small New England states. So historically, we really lived in North Dakota off the federal investment in conservation. So our farm bill programs like CRP, some of the Department of Interior programs as well. And as a state, what we've done is paid for access to those lands. So with our plots program, the state of the federal budget has left a lot of those programs to decline. They're no longer very competitive here in North Dakota. We've seen, for instance, 2 million acres of CRP go away in our state. That's been a reduction of about $100 million of federal investment in North Dakota. So it's really time for North Dakota to step up and take care of this ourselves. We have the resources to do that, and we can make a much greater investment, and we are convinced that we can do that and fund our schools and fund our infrastructure. It's really not, I think Mr. Godfrey's group is setting this up as a choice. The other choice people have is all of the above, and we believe we can make the investments for schools, infrastructure, and conservation.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Number 7, if this measure is passed, the trust will be funded by 5% of the state share of the oil extraction tax. How much money is this expected to generate over the next 4 years if this measure passes? Steve?
Yeah, so OMB's estimate of a biennium is $259 million per biennium, so about $130 million a year over the next 4 years. So 5% of the extraction tax would go to this. 95% of the extraction tax would go to other funds. And there are several funds already set up that designate extraction tax dollar. We have the Common Schools Trust Fund, the Foundation Aid Fund, we have the Resources Trust Fund, and the Legacy Fund. So this is a tradition that we've had in North Dakota in designating this prosperity from the oil boom into these special funds. We really don't depend on them to run a general fund in our state. A general fund the legislature has wisely capped at $300 million a biennium, and so the rest of that $10 billion goes into the special funds that we have in the state.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
John?
Well, and Steve's correct with the OMB's forecast on what it would be for the next biennium. I would just like to point out that OMB forecast is historically very, very conservative. We're putting our numbers more along the lines of the $300 million a biennium. We think that's very conservative as well. So, and you got to take into account too that our oil development is going to continue to grow. We're going to continue to get more wells online. More oil will be coming out of the ground. We forecast that this measure, over the life of the measure, to be just about $5 billion going into this fund, which is clearly a massive amount. I want to go back and touch back on Steve's comment about setting this up as a choice. And I guess we look at it as we've got our legislators, we've got our elected officials, our leaders in our state have come to us and said, here's what we're looking at for the budget going forward. If this measure passes, we're going to have to make some serious decisions on the infrastructure spending and the education side of spending, and then you can probably pretty much throw tax relief out the window. So it's important to note that, and also within our group, we've got over 100 legislators have signed on. 30 mayors across our state. So the leaders that we've elected to govern our state and to run those budgets are coming to us saying, here are the issues we see. So I think there's a pretty sound rationale there.
Thank you, John. Question number 8. The measure states that the Commission must allocate no less than 75% nor more than 90% of the revenue deposited in the fund on an annual basis. Two questions to this. What types of programs or projects would be funded through the trust? And what if the funding requests do not total the 75% threshold? Start with John.
Well, I think that hits at a very important piece of this measure that we have an issue with, the 75% spending mandate. I can't think of a priority necessarily that would be, it makes sense to mandate spending through our Constitution to cover. As far as what projects this would address, I think some of the only ones that we've heard is a state CRP program. To me, that makes more sense to have that discussion at a legislative level. That's a pretty big policy change. And and the proponents of this measure will say, well, the state CRP program is going to be a boom for farmers. We've got every egg organization, over 360,000 farmers have come out opposed to this measure, as well as both of the Agriculture Commission candidates that are running to become the next egg commissioner in this state. So the egg community clearly doesn't buy into the state CRP program or what that could do. And it's also important, Steve talks about the low investment that North Dakota has had into conservation. We're an agriculture state. Farmers and ranchers have been our conservationists. They're the first conservationists. They've done a great job of maintaining our land. They live off the land. They need that land to be productive. They need that land to, that's what they get their livelihood from. So I think that's a lot of why maybe those dollars you haven't necessarily seen going into the conservation side of things, but we are putting a lot of money into conservation as well, and through our state parks, through the Game and Fish, through the Outdoor Heritage Fund now, as well as the federal investment. So,
okay. Thank you, John. Steve?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this point, Jerry. So there is actually confusion, and we think that our opponents are misreading the measure when they talk about mandated spending. You read it correctly when you said the money has to be allocated. So what this measure does, it sets up a fund, which is analogous to a checking account, and a trust, which is analogous to a savings account. And it says 75% of that money must be allocated. It could be allocated to projects today, projects in the future, or if there are not enough projects to be funded, more could be put into the trust and saved for the future. So there's not going to be wasteful spending from projects that don't fit the purposes of the fund. So that's clearly not the case of this measure. Now, the ideas, Mr. Gottfried is correct in talking about one of the big ideas is a state-run CRP program. The estimates that could cost about $120 million a year, just that one program alone. And the reason the Outdoor Heritage Fund hasn't seen that is they simply don't have enough resources to address a program like that. They've only been able to address about 25% of the needs that are out there, so there's been $56 million of projects submitted, and they've only been able to fund 25%. So it would be foolish for an applicant to submit an application that's that big. There's just no way it's going to happen. So people scale back their proposals. The other idea is, if you take a look at what Grand Forks has done with their Greenway, they have moved their infrastructure out of the harm's way of the Red River Valley, and you don't see them going through the agonizing flood battles every year that the rest of our towns and cities do in the state. We can do that around North Dakota to create parks and recreation along our rivers, give room for that rivers to go up and down and not have those flooding battles that we have. We've also done the analysis on state parks in North Dakota. It's been 30 years since we established a new state park. There are interests around the state in establishing more state parks and more city and county parks as our communities continue to grow. A lot of that land, that farmland, gets gobbled up by residential and commercial development. This fund would allow us to add parks strategically as a community grows. So there's tremendous needs. We've collected ideas right now that would spend about $400 million a year just on the ideas that we have today, and we think that the ideas of North Dakotans and would continue to grow, and this fund would be oversubscribed like we've seen with all the other conservation funds in this state.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Steve will take the first or the next question first. What impact, if this trust, will this trust fund have on other state funding needs, such as education, roads, bridges, highways, and human services? Steve?
Yeah, so we believe that it will have really no impact on those other needs. If you look at our education system, both the university system and the primary secondary system, they're funded in North Dakota out of the general fund. Again, we talked earlier about the general fund. It caps the oil and gas revenue into that fund at $300 million a biennium. So we have $10 billion a biennium coming into this state. The general fund will clearly be funded, so there will be no impact on education funding. If you look at the infrastructure proposal that Mr. Gottfried mentioned, that would come out of the Strategic Investment Improvement Fund. It's one of the special funds that the state has. That fund will have $4 billion the next biennium. So we can fund this measure, we can fund that infrastructure, and still have several billion dollars left over to meet these other needs. We are a wealthy state. We have resources to do this.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. John?
Well, and we obviously disagree. We think there'll be a tremendous impact on our different needs across our state. Mr. Adair talks about funding higher education through the general fund. What he doesn't talk about is the one-time spending that has gone into a lot of the infrastructure on our universities across our state, including our schools. The $2 billion infrastructure plan we think is probably the right way to go for North Dakota. If you don't think that a measure that takes 5% of the revenue or $300 million off the table doesn't have an impact on some of those things, I guess I again would turn you to your elected leaders who have looked at this, and they're the ones who really have to make those decisions going forward. And our schools are bursting at the seams. We've got more students now than we've ever had, and with that comes increased investment, and we've got to have the flexibility to be able to do that. And by mandating spending and mandating this into the Constitution, it really ties the hands of our elected officials, and it really ties the hands of those leaders who you have elected to lead and to make those decisions. It kind of hamstrings them. I want to touch back a little bit on the 75% spending mandate again as well. The allocated versus spending piece, I guess, doesn't really jive with me. It's off the table regardless. You got 75% of that money has got to be used every year, which we think is a poor public policy decision. And when you come forward with a grant proposal that matches up to the 75% spending threshold and put that in the lap of the Industrial Commission to say, okay, here's our plan, you really put them in a bind of either you choose to accept everything that we've put forward, or you're in violation of the Constitution. So really the governance that has been set up in this measure, there is no governance. It ends up being that through that advisory board, which we think isn't what North Dakota needs.
Thanks, John. Number 10, may the fund be used to buy land. Concerns have been expressed that money from the fund can be used to buy land, thereby taking it out of agricultural production and the potential tax rolls. How do you respond to this concern? John?
Well, I think it says it right in the measure that the money can be used to acquire land. And the proponents of this measure will say, well, the final decision will be made by the governor and the Industrial Commission. There's the corporate farming law in our state. I got a couple points on that. I think Ducks Unlimited and a lot of the conservation groups are involved in a lawsuit to try to overturn that law. When you have that 75% spending mandate within the measure, again, you put it in the hands of the governor to say, okay, either you can approve what we've submitted or be in violation of the Constitution. And then we'll again sue you to push through what we got. So there really is the buying land piece is true, and I think if the conservation groups brought it forward and they say, well, we're not going to be in the market of buying land. We don't want to buy land. We don't want to become landowners. Our question has always been back to them. Well, then why is it in the measure? Why is it a part of the measure? If land purchase isn't an option or wasn't intended, it was very carefully crafted measure to put in there. So why is it in the measure?
Thanks, John. Steve?
Yeah, Jerry. So the primary purpose of the funding for this measure is really for voluntary incentive-based conservation. North Dakota's land is 95% owned by our farmers and ranchers, and really when you look at conservation programs that work on the ground, it's these incentive-based programs for our farmers and ranchers. So that's where most of the money will go. It'll be a state CRP program, it'll be rotational grazing, it'll be things like winter wheat, it'll provide buffers for our drinking water. There isn't a provision for land acquisition there, and it says that it is specifically for parks. And we have heard across the state interest in establishing new parks, and I hope their opposition agrees that that we do need to add some parks in the state as our land continues to grow. But remember, the Industrial Commission has the final say on how those funds should be used. We have complete faith that they are not going to let anything negative happen to agriculture through land acquisition, and they do not have to spend the money. If there is some programs that they do not agree with, they can put that money in the trust. It does not have to be spent. It just has to be allocated. And our purpose there was to avoid sitting on money and not making decisions. They can make the decision to put that money in the trust and save it for future projects. So that, this is a scare tactic that's been percolated out there. It's simply not true. And when we talk to the average farmer and rancher out on the ground, they're excited about this program and the options it will provide them for their operations.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Number 11, in the petition title it states, the fund is to be used to make grants to public and private groups. In the full context, the measure states, fund that shall be used for grants to state agencies, tribal governments, local governments, political subdivisions, and nonprofit organizations for the following purposes. Does this mean that private groups may receive monies for initiatives? Steve?
Yeah, so you covered it very well. The eligible entities are state agencies, cities and counties, political subdivisions, so school boards, park boards, the tribes. The federal government is not eligible for applications, and nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits are established as serving a public purpose. So all of those entities would be available for that. And if you look at the range of applications that the Outdoor Heritage Fund has received, a lot of those grants have gone to our state agencies. There's great interest among park districts that's out there. Our local conservation districts have made great use of that fund, and we expect a similar pattern once this fund would be established.
Okay. John?
Well, I guess my only comment back on that is, within the measure it can go to state agencies and all these different groups. The way we see it and the way it's been kind of tipped off by even Mr. Adair has been quoted in the paper saying that this money, they'd like to see this money being able to be used for staffing and used for research activities. We've seen those activities or those grants come through the Outdoor Heritage Fund. We've been pretty firm in saying that these dollars can't be used for staffing. We don't believe that North Dakota taxpayer dollars should go to nonprofit organizations to cover their overhead, to cover their staffing, to cover their research. And frankly, we believe many North Dakotans feel the same way. That's what their member dollars are for. That's why we go out and I'm part of the chamber. That's why we go out and get members. That's why Steve goes out to get members as Ducks Unlimited, to cover those costs. So we think that this fund, given the setup, given the advisory board makeup, given the spending mandate within there, given the dollar amount, and given what we've seen over in Minnesota, that it's really being looked at as kind of a boom for a lot of these conservation groups. This is a chance for them to come in and really get a lot of money to run through their organization, which we don't think is the right place for it to be.
Okay. Thank you, John. Question 12. Would you comment on, or please discuss, the structure of the commission and the Citizens Review Board that would be overseeing the fund? Starting off with John.
Well, it's a 13-member advisory board. Many of those members are appointed by the governor. They also include the Senate and majority and minority leaders from both the House and the Senate. There is the issue we have is there's one farmer and rancher that's being appointed by the Ag Commissioner. There's one energy industry representative that's being appointed by the PSC. You compare that with the Outdoor Heritage Fund, where we've got 4 farmers and ranchers, a business representative, energy representative, conservation at large, 4 representatives there as well as having Parks and Rec individuals serve on that board. So we think that the makeup of the Outdoor Heritage Fund, not only statutorily and the entire makeup of it, but that advisory board makes better sense for North Dakota. We think that's how policy has been done in our state, and we think it works very well. You bring a diverse group of people to sit down at a table, and everybody looks at everything a little bit differently. Whereas this group, and within the measure itself, it says you've got to have experience in conservational practices, which I understand the point of it, it makes sense, but at the same time it's nice with the Outdoor Heritage Fund board to have some of those views that maybe aren't ingrained into the conservation community to bring up other points. We think that this advisory board is simply weighted too heavily against our energy and our ag community, and that's why we feel it's biased, and we would much rather support the Outdoor Heritage Fund.
John, thank you. Steve?
Yeah, so we believe this advisory board would be one of the most diverse ever established in North Dakota by having a combination of citizens and legislators. It brings in even a broader perspective than the Outdoor Heritage Fund board that we have right now. You really want these boards to make decisions based on information, to be objective about things, and having people that have expertise in this field makes a lot of sense in order to do that. The Outdoor Heritage Board has worked well, but we do see a lot of politics coming into play there. We see people making decisions based on political considerations and not really technical considerations about what's the best conservation for North Dakota. And so this board would tend to damper down some of the politics that currently exist on the Outdoor Heritage Board, and we think that would serve the people better in making these decisions.
Thank you, Steve. And our final question, the 13, it's ending in the way it should end, so Steve will be the one to start off the answering on 13. Question 13 says the amendment has a 25-year lifespan. Explain what that means, and could it be changed or altered in any way prior to the end of the 25-year lifespan? Or why does or does not the public conservation need to be part of the state constitution? Steve?
Yeah, so we believe that the health of the land and water in North Dakota is really fundamental to our existence as people, and we believe protecting that in the Constitution just makes a lot of sense for this state. Our future health, our future well-being will depend on healthy land and water, and conservation and the Constitution will provide the people's will to be carried out there. It does. We did have concerns expressed by John and some of his group about this being permanently in place in the Constitution, and so the 25 years was a good suggestion. It allows us to revisit at that point in time, is this fund still needed? Do we still have great needs? And it was really the thinking there was that was about the time span that was predicted for the Bakken development to continue. So once that, we know these oil booms wax and wane, so they tend to grow, and then at some point they'll decline, and then the needs in the state should be revisited at that time. So in 25 years it automatically goes back to the people to decide, does the fund need to stay in place, or do we need to make some adjustments at that time?
Thank you. John?
Well, I think your question draws out an important point that this fund cannot be changed without another constitutional amendment if it passes, which we all know a constitutional amendment is very, very difficult. I think we've got a strong feeling in our state that our Constitution is sacred, and you better be darn sure that what you're putting into the Constitution is correct, and there's nothing wrong with it. We've kind of outlined some of our issues today with what the problems are. One point I'd like to touch on too is that this fund does have a 25-year, I guess, sunset, and then it'll be automatically up for a revote in 25 years. What isn't talked about is that trust fund. That trust fund will go on in perpetuity, which so North Dakotans are going to have to make that decision on how they feel about they're not only voting on this fund, they're also voting on the trust fund that'll be in existence forever, and will be under the guidelines of this measure, which again we've outlined some of our very serious concerns with, whether it's the mandated spending or how much money it comes out of going into infrastructure and education. So that's the decision that the North Dakota voters will have before them.
Thank you, John. We'll move into concluding comments. Since John started us off, or have you start us off for concluding remarks, Steve, if you would. So. 30 seconds.
You bet, Jerry. So, we're excited about this opportunity for the people really to be heard on this. We've talked a lot about the legislature and how things operate there. And I think it's important to remember that the legislature is there to serve the people, not vice versa. And we have heard over and over that the people are very concerned about this issue. They want to see a greater investment in conservation in North Dakota. And we have a lot to lose if we don't do this. We have a rich outdoor heritage in this state, a great recreational opportunity. That's going to go away if we don't make a significant investment. We'll continue to struggle with flood control in the state and not really put in place permanent solutions if we're not able to pass this measure. And our land and water will become more challenged. It will become more contaminated. It will have some big issues. We can be proactive, we can be visionary, and we can prevent all that. And we just urge people to take a look at the facts, to really think about what's important to them in this state, and to vote yes on 5 come November 4th.
Thank you, Steve. John?
Well, thanks, Jerry, and thanks again to the League of Women Voters for putting this on. It's obviously a very important issue. North Dakotans will have a choice in November when looking at this measure. I think we've outlined pretty well what some of our concerns are and what the guts of the measure have to say. I think oftentimes when I look at measures, I look at who's going to benefit from this if it passes. And we've got some real concerns about what has gone on in other states with a lot of these groups that have come in and pushed a measure similar to this, they're trying to get after our wealth in North Dakota. Our group that has been formed, we're a broad-based group that generally don't always agree on everything. Whether it's Farm Bureau and Farmers Union, and our entire ag community has come out against this measure. I'm not a farmer by trade. I didn't grow up on a farm, but when the entire ag community comes up and opposes the measure, I think that's very important to take note. as well as the business community, as well as the energy community, and even our educational leaders, those who have to set the budgets within our schools, have come out and adamantly opposed this measure. So there are some real concerns there in terms of funding, in terms of what this measure would do to infrastructure and education and addressing our needs across our state. So with that in mind, and with the constitutionality of it and the spending mandate and the different issues we've gone over today, I guess we'd really encourage a no vote, and at the very least make sure you understand what the measure is and go get your information.
Thank you, John. I would like to thank John Gottfried and Steve Adair for taking their time, spending this short time with us, but valuable. I think one of the dangers is you have 8 measures on this year's ballot, and which really requires a little bit more study, a little bit more conversation, and I appreciate you gentlemen taking your time.
Thank you.
Coming here to do this, get that information out there. I'd also like to thank the League of Women Voters and the Dakota Media Access people for staging this for us and allowing this information to be disseminated across the state. Thank you and God bless.